This lecture is part of the West Indian Soldier Heritage Project, carried out in partnership with the National Army Museum and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The French Revolutionary Wars. Revolution in the Caribbean between 1793 and 1802. In 1792, the French Revolutionary government declared war on Austria due to a fear that the latter would invade France, Austria being closely aligned to the old royalist regime through Marie Antoinette, wife of Louis XVI. This began a series of conflicts that would continue until 1815. In 1793, Britain entered the war against France as part of a coalition which also included Austria, Spain, Holland, Prussia and Sardinia. Naturally, the conflict spread to the Caribbean, with Britain aiming to capture the wealthy French colonies. Where this differed from previous wars fought over the last century was that there was now an internal threat in the British colonies in the region, one of uprising inspired by French revolutionary ideals. The message of liberté, égalité and fraternité echoed with many slaves in the region, but also with those further down the social spectrum of the plantocracy, including free blacks and poor whites. Several such uprisings did emerge throughout the region, not only on British islands. The most famous of these uprisings was the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave rebellion in history. Britain began its operations in the Caribbean by recapturing Tobago, which the French had captured during the American Revolutionary War. Troops landed on the 14th of April 1793 and were able to force a French surrender the following day. Attention then turned to Martinique, where French royalists still loyal to the old regime were leading a revolt against the Republicans in control of the island. A force of some 1,100 men under the command of Major General Thomas Bruce landed between the 17th and the 19th of June and launched an attack towards St. Pierre, supported by some 800 French royalists. When they drew near to St. Pierre's defensive batteries, the royalist column began firing on each other in error, and in the ensuing confusion their commander was wounded. The royalists, unwilling to carry on without their stricken officer, withdrew. This too forced the British to withdraw, as they now lacked the numbers to carry out this assault. Shortly afterwards, the decision was taken to abandon Martinique. When the British set sail to Barbados on the 22nd of June, they took with them some 5,000 royalist refugees, despite blaming the incompetence of the royalists for their failure. In line with previous wars, an expedition to the Caribbean from Britain was planned. Subject to severe delays as normal, a force of some 7,000 men was assembled, some 11,000 less than originally planned for the task. Setting sail on the 26th of November 1793, the commanders arrived at Barbados on the 6th of January 1794, where they discovered that a contingent of troops that was supposed to have already arrived had not done so, nor, due to unclear orders, had the forces already stationed in the Caribbean been focused at Barbados. In charge of the land operations was Lieutenant General Sir Charles Grey, who had previously fought in both the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, and had experience of Caribbean combat. He was ably supported at sea by Vice Admiral Sir John Jarvis. Whilst waiting for the remainder of his men to arrive, Grey set to training his officers and men in techniques he had developed during the American Revolutionary War, which we would now identify as skirmishing tactics. These were far more suited to combat in the West Indies than the traditional battle lines of the wars fought in Europe. Grey was famous for his surprise attacks, fighting his enemy at close quarters and often under cover of night. His preferred tactics included getting close and fighting with bayonets in this manner, forbidding his soldiers to fire, which in turn led to his nickname No Flint Grey, with some reports saying that he took away the flints necessary to cause the spark that fired the guns. By the end of January, the expedition was ready to make its move, with Grey and Jarvis determining that Martinique would be the first target, as there was still unrest on that island and the defences were still weak. The British arrived at Martinique on the 5th of February, with Grey opting to land his forces in 3 separate locations: Galleon Bay, Castanavir and the Bay of Marin. This would allow him to prevent the defenders from gathering together. All 3 landings were successful and the British began driving inland. Grey, in personal command of the southern force, took a dangerous road through the mountains to Rivière-Salée. When he arrived, the French sent a detachment against him, but he was able to repel this at bayonet point during the night of the 7th. Grey's force rendezvoused with the eastern force at Mont-Bruno on the 13th. 2 British columns managed to capture St. Pierre on the 17th, which meant that the last obstacles to be overcome were the defences at Fort Royal. It took time to build the batteries to assail Forts Bourbon and Fort Louis due to the heavy rains, and they did not open fire until the 7th of March. British troops were then able to overwhelm and capture the town of Fort Royal, but Fort Louis was only captured when Captain Faulkner, commanding the Zebra, ran his ship aground under the walls of the fort and stormed it with his men. The French commander, Rochambeau, seeing the hopelessness of his situation, surrendered, and the garrison marched out on the 23rd of March, with Martinique in British hands. Grey maintained his multiple landings tactic at his next port of call, St. Lucia, arriving on the 1st of April and landing in 4 locations. His troops then marched along the coastline and rendezvoused at Morne Fortune on the 2nd of April. Colonel Coote led a raiding party to storm the French defences just outside the main fortress with no casualties. This was apparently done with nothing but Grey's bayonet tactics. The French then surrendered that evening. Grey, resupplying at Martinique, quickly moved on to Guadeloupe, landing on the 11th of April at Gosier. On the night of the 12th, Fort Fleur d'Épée and another fortification on nearby Morne-Mascotte was overwhelmed at bayonet point. With the island of Grande-Terre now largely secure, Grey continued to Basse-Terre Island on the 14th, landing at Petit-Bourg and marching along the coastal road, whilst the second force landed to the northwest of Basse-Terre town and marched south to rendezvous with Grey. General Collot, commanding the French defenders, realised that he was overwhelmed and opted to surrender. Grey and Jarvis had now obtained their objectives in the Caribbean, but now had to retain their prizes. Rising levels of sickness amongst the men made it difficult to hold on to these captured territories. Reinforcements from Ireland helped to offset some of these difficulties, but news arrived of French reinforcements in the Caribbean in the early June. These reinforcements were able to force the much-reduced British garrison on Grande-Terre, Guadeloupe to withdraw. Grey mustered his forces and landed his men on Grande-Terre on the 19th of June, but despite some initial successes, his men were both exhausted and sick. He was forced to fall back to Basse-Terre Island and resolved to cut Grande-Terre off. Grey and Jarvis were both recalled to London for an inquiry into the distribution of prize money, which both men were furious with, as the scheme had previously been approved in London, and the men in the Caribbean would suffer badly as the prize money had made up for their inadequate pay in the expensive West Indies. They sailed from the Caribbean on the 27th of November to successfully fight the accusations against them. The French, led by Commissioner Victor Hughes, attacked Basse-Terre Island again in late September, forcing the British garrison at Berville to surrender. Despite a notably valiant defence, the British defenders' numbers were too few, and those that there were too sick to repel the attackers. At Basse-Terre town, General Prescott managed to hold out in Fort Matilda from the 14th of October to the 10th of December with the help of the Royal Navy. Finally, however, with his men almost out of ammunition and the walls of the fort crumbling around them, Prescott was able to evacuate his men to the ships and sail for Martinique. Lieutenant General Sir John Vaughan, Grey's replacement commanding the forces in the Caribbean, took stock of his situation. He particularly paid attention to the issue that whilst the British had lost very few men in combat, they had died by their thousands due to sickness. Vaughan thus revisited an idea which some British commanders had examined before, but had never acted upon: the creation of new regiments specifically formed to resist the diseases that had so frequently ravaged British troops in the region. It was noticed by the doctors of the time that people of African heritage were more resistant to the fevers that had proved so fatal to the white troops. Vaughan thus proposed the creation of new permanent regiments raised to defend the Caribbean, recruited from the black population of the Caribbean, most notably from the slave population. Henry Dundas, the Minister for War in the colonies in London, although initially reluctant, approved the idea to address the urgent need for more men. The West India Regiments, as they came to be known, were first established in 1795. Although they were largely made up of slaves, they were to be commanded by white officers from the British Army. 1795 also saw an uprising on the British island of Grenada, whilst the Caribs of St. Vincent and the Maroons of Jamaica, each with their own grievances against the British, took up arms. The French took advantage of these uprisings and encouraged and provided support on Grenada and St. Vincent. Vaughan sent troops under his command to help quell these uprisings, choosing to prioritise Grenada over St Vincent. Despite this, the rebels gained the advantage and controlled much of the island by the end of March, with the British forces largely ensconced in the capital of St George's. The recently captured island of St Lucia, with much of its population loyal to revolutionary France, also rose in revolt. Despite reinforcements from the 34th and 61st Regiments of Foot, Brigadier General Stewart, commanding, was eventually forced to abandon the island on the 19th of April, sailing his 1,200 men to Martinique. Whilst these were taking place, a new expedition from Britain was planned, originally to be the largest ever, some 30,000 men under General Sir Ralph Abercromby. His orders gave him two primary objectives, the recapture of both St Lucia and Guadeloupe, with his secondary objective including the capture of the Dutch colonies in South America. After many delayed starts due to bad weather, the fleet finally successfully set sail in February 1796. However, many of the men became sick on the voyage. Abercromby arrived at Barbados in March 1796, discovering that some of the men that had arrived before him had already been sent to reinforce Grenada and St Vincent. The following month, the Dutch colonies of Demerara, Essequibo and Berbice all opted to surrender to the British without the need for fighting. In the middle of April, the majority of the expedition finally arrived in Barbados, giving Abercromby that which he needed to pursue his primary targets. Marshalling a force of 8,000 men, Abercromby departed Barbados to retake St Lucia, arriving on the 25th of April. Landings were made in three locations, on the 26th, 27th and 28th respectively, and the British moved in to seize the principal French stronghold at Morne Fortune. Following a failed assault on the lower slopes of the mountain on the 3rd of May, Abercromby was left with little choice but to besiege the stronghold. Reinforcements brought his total available troops to between 12 and 13,000 men, but progress was nevertheless slow. The British kept up a heavy rate of fire, firing some 1,700 shells a day at the French defences. An outpost on the eastern side of Morne Fortune was captured on the 24th of May with heavy losses from amongst the 27th Regiment of Foot. With their stores of food and water and medicine running low, the French opted to surrender on the 25th of May. Their losses had been heavy, as many as 1,400 men over the course of the siege, compared to some 566 on the British side. With this, Britain had secured St Lucia once again, although some French troops that fled into the island's interior gave the British garrison trouble for months to come. Following this, Abercromby departed St Lucia and went on to St Vincent to assist in the war against the Caribs and their French Republican allies, depositing some troops on Grenada en route. British forces on St Vincent had continued to resist the Caribs and their French allies with minimal success. The West India Regiments had had their first taste of combat on St Vincent when the 2nd West India Regiment came into combat with the Caribs at Mount William on the 8th of January 1796. The arrival of Abercromby's force on the 7th of June 1796 allowed the British to push the combined Franco-Carib force back from near Kingstown. They would continue to clash with the Caribs until the middle of October 1796, when the Caribs finally surrendered. Whilst the hostilities on St Vincent continued, Abercromby took his forces to Grenada, arriving on the 16th of June. Again, the tide slowly turned against the rebels, and over the coming months the island was restored to British control. The 1st West India Regiment were involved in these actions on Grenada alongside local forces and other British regiments, and they had managed to largely suppress the main threat of the rebellion by December 1796. They would later be joined by the 2nd West India Regiment, who assisted in restoring peace to the island between June 1797 and August 1800. With his tasks complete, Abercromby returned to Britain in August 1796, but was sent back to the Caribbean a few months later, arriving at Martinique in early January 1797, with orders to seize Trinidad and Puerto Rico. Assembling a force of some 3,750 men, he arrived on the 17th of February near Port of Spain, Trinidad, which they seized with little difficulty, and the Spanish governor opted to surrender the following day. After return to Martinique to prepare, Abercromby's force then set off for Puerto Rico, where the general was the first ashore and drove back a small Spanish detachment sent out to meet them. Seeing the defences of the town of San Juan, Abercromby opted for a bombardment, but this proved ineffective. Faced with a change in the weather, which could have left his force isolated, Abercromby opted to withdraw. He later returned to Britain in August that year, marking the end of the last great British expedition sent to the region. In August 1799, Dutch Suriname surrendered without a fight, despite the garrison composed of Dutch and Spanish troops being larger than the 1,000 British troops sent against them. The following year, in September, Curaçao and Aruba also surrendered. 1801 saw an expedition sent out from the British Caribbean islands under the command of Lieutenant General Thomas Trigg to sweep through the northern Leeward Islands. Trigg's expedition saw the surrender of Swedish St. Barts, Dutch St. Eustatius and Sabre, Danish St. Croix, St. John and St. Thomas, and finally the combined Franco-Dutch island of St. Martin. Amongst other British forces, the 2nd West India Regiment aided in the capture of the French side of the island, whilst in their first experience of actual combat, the 8th West India Regiment assisted the 64th Regiment of Foot as skirmishers in the capture of Fort Amsterdam on the Dutch side. May 1802 saw the Peace of Amiens, a break in the fighting lasting a little over a year. Although there is debate about the topic by historians, many consider this to be the break between the French Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars. Under the terms of the treaty, Britain once again returned all the colonies that it had captured to their former owners, with the exception of Trinidad, which it retained. The French Revolutionary Wars proved that Britain had largely perfected warfare in the Caribbean, operating together with the Royal Navy in harmony and at speed to overwhelm their targets. Disease, however, remained a deadly force after these invasions and limited the ability of the British to hold on to these conquests, which in turn led to the decision to raise a body of men specifically for service in the Caribbean, who were known to be more resistant to disease. These West India regiments proved their effectiveness in the French Revolutionary Wars and would go on to even greater heights in the Napoleonic Wars. For more information about this topic, as well as the history and heritage of the Caribbean and the work of the West India Committee, please visit us at westindiacommittee.org. Thank you.